Hello there my beloved Batties, and welcome to another episode of Truth Behind the Tale, the series where I take a look at some of our most famous fairy tales and delve into their real-world historical and cultural origins. And today we're going to be taking a look at Jack and the Beanstalk. Strap in, Batties, this one is a wormhole. First, let's start with the written history to give us some grounding. Jack and his tale are rarely referenced in pre-18th century literature, save for an allusion in Shakespeare's King Lear, where Edgar cries, "Fee, foe and fum, I smell the blood of a British man." The earliest version of the Jack story which we might recognise first appeared in print in 1711 as The History of Jack and the Giants by J. White of Newcastle. This was followed by the first version of Jack and the Beanstalk in 1734, published in the second edition of Roundabout Our Cold Fire, under the title The Story of Jack Spriggins and the Enchanted Bean. It portrays a hero who gains the sympathy of a man's wife before hiding in his house, stealing his possessions, and then killing him. Yeah, some hero. 70 years later, it was presented in a moralised version by Benjamin Tabart as The History of Jack and the Beanstalk, in keeping with the conventions of the time, which encouraged children's literature to be instructive and aimed at bettering their spiritual and moral progress. This underlying theme was presented in context by a fairy who told Jack that the giant had robbed and killed his father, and so Jack himself was justified in his actions of doing the same to the giant in an act of retribution. In 1845 it was popularised in the Home Treasury by British civil servant Henry Cole, writing under the name Felix Summerlee, then rewritten again in 1890's English fairy tales by Joseph Jacobs. This final version is the one which is most commonly reproduced today and is generally taken to be closer in tone to the earliest oral variant because it removes the Victorian moralising which was given to it. Joseph Jacobs maintained that there was no moralisation in the version that he read as a child, and the children knew that robbery and murder was wrong without having to be explicitly told so in a fairy tale. Heading back to Tabart, however, his History of Jack and the Beanstalk does not contain all the accounts of the story's origins, but before we delve into that, we need to take a look at another fairy tale, and the history of Jack himself. Jack and the Beanstalk is the most famous of the Jack tales. Jack is a stock character who appears in a number of English and Cornish legends, fairy tales and nursery rhymes. In this way, he corresponds with similar stock male characters such as Hans in Germany and Ivan in Russia. Jack is usually a lazy or foolish young adult who manages to triumph over adversity by means of his tricks and his cunning. Besides Jack and the Beanstalk, some of the most famous appearances of Jack are Jack Frost, Little Jack Horner, This is the House That Jack Built, Jack and Jill, Jack Be Nimble, and Jack the Giant Killer. This last one is interesting because it shares many similarities and elements to what we also associate with Jack and the Beanstalk, to the point where the two are essentially two sides of the same coin. Because of that, from this point on, I'm also going to be drawing comparisons and similarities from it as well as from Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack the Giant Killer as a character slays several giants during the reign of King Arthur, himself a prominent figure in Cornish, Breton and Welsh lore. In the same folkloric vein, giants are also prominent. St Michael's Mount, for example, in Cornwall, is claimed to be the setting of Jack the Giant Killer, and where the giant's heart is still visible as a stone in the path leading up to the castle. It's probably the case that by the time the first Jack story was printed in 1711, as we mentioned at the start of this video, the publisher was compiling anecdotes about giants to effectively string the story together. Due to Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur being out of print since 1634 at this point, there's speculation that by the early 18th century the public had started to grow weary of the King Arthur stories, which themselves were filled with grandiosity and giant killing. As a result, Jack may have been created to essentially take his place as the everyman who relied on wit rather than kingship to prevail, essentially as a framing device for a number of gory giant killing adventures. Jack became a familiar figure as the 18th century drew on, with Jack the Giant Killer seemingly being performed at the Haymarket in 1730, and John Newbery publishing fictional letters about him in A Little Pretty Pocketbook in 1744. It's also interesting to note that an analogy about Jack and the Beanstalk was drawn by none other than the Brothers Grimm. They likened it to a tale that they had collected in Germany called The Devil with the Three Golden Hairs, but when it was first translated to English, curiously, it was renamed The Giant and the Three Golden Hairs in order to avoid offending readers. In this story, the 14-year-old hero is due to marry the king's daughter, but in an effort to avoid it, the king dispatches him to go into hell and return with 3 of the devil's golden hairs. Along the way, the boy uses his wit to progress, including tricking the ferryman to take him across the river into hell, until he finds the devil's grandmother, who promises to help him and turns him into an ant so that he can hide in the folds of her clothing. This is similar to the giant's wife in Jack and the Beanstalk, who attempts to hide him from her husband. When the devil comes home, he is sure he can smell human flesh, but is convinced to sit down and eat, after which he lays his head on his grandmother's lap and falls asleep. This allows the boy the chance to pluck the hairs and escape. Another Brothers Grimm tale which slots into the picture at this point is The Brave Little Tailor. This character goes out into the world to seek his fortune and uses trickery and psychological manipulation to outwit the giants he comes into contact with. And yet another parallel, which brings us back to Celtic Breton culture, is Bluebeard, which, as we found in a previous episode, is taken to be inspired by the cruel King Connemore of Brittany, a figure from both folklore and history. More info on that by clicking the card. Bluebeard contains a character filled with violent misogyny who chases the heroine with the intent of killing her after she discovers his secret. Similarities can be drawn here to the way the giant chases Jack down the beanstalk. Interestingly, as a side note, the giant who lived on St. Michael's Mount, the setting of Jack the Giant Killer, was called Cormoran, itself perhaps a derivative of King Connemore. Now, returning to the common roots of the Jacks and the Giants, we also find new tangents which make the absolute source of the fairy tale very difficult to pin down, but which also point to the various forms it may take and derive from based on cultures and histories from all over the world. One similarity may be drawn to David and Goliath from the biblical book of Samuel, but researchers at Durham University and the NOVA University Lisbon found sources to suggest it to be over 5 millennia old. It may have originated from a time in history predating the written word, existing in an oral form and being passed down through many different cultures. This would have resulted in a number of versions which share similarities but are themselves different to the most well-known English tale. A huge number of world cultures have their own stories of monsters and heroes, and discussing every single one of them would result in a whole other video series which I simply don't have the means to produce. But I'll do my best to summarise and draw the connections here. The best place to start, considering Jack's relation to England and Cornwall, is with the Celts. Giants are very common in British folklore and may represent the original inhabitants, ancestors, forces of nature, or gods of the land before the coming of man, with their huge size representing the size of their otherworldly nature. In the folklore, they're usually responsible for the creation of the natural landscape, and are often frozen in place by being petrified to death, a common motif in both Celtic and Norse mythology, but we'll come back to the Norse stuff in more detail shortly. The Carnaby giant, a 180-foot tall hill figure in Dorset, has no clear origin, but one story claims that a giant from Denmark led an invasion to the British coast, and when he slept on the hillside, the locals crept up on him and cut off his head. In 1836, Geoffrey of Monmouth, one of the main developers of the Arthurian tales, reported in the first book of his imaginative The History of the Kings of Britain that Cornwall's indigenous giants were slaughtered by Brutus and his brothers, who had fled to the island after the Trojan War, with Brutus himself becoming the namesake of Britain. After the giants were defeated by Brutus and his brothers, the account goes on to mention a battle between the giant leader Gog-Magog and the warrior Corineus. This provides yet another similarity to the later fairy tale, as Corineus throws the giant from the cliff into the sea, as Jack sends the giant falling to his death from the beanstalk. Returning to King Arthur and Celtic tales, in the Welsh story Culhwch and Olwen, which has been dated to the 11th or 12th century, Arthur is a chief among the kings of Britain and cousin to the hero Culhwch. He comes to Arthur's court in Cornwall and demands for his bride Olwen, the daughter of a giant. As a result, the giant sets a series of impossible tasks which Arthur's champions are honour bound to fulfil before he will allow his daughter to be married. The details of this not only share similarities to the manner in which Jack outwits the giants in the fairy tales, but also with Norse mythology, which is itself filled with giants, and may have combined its influence with Celtic culture following the arrival of the Vikings in Britain. Along with tales of trolls and similar beings, which can also be petrified in sunlight, in Norse mythology the world itself is made from the body of a slain giant, and the 9 worlds of Yggdrasil include Jotunheim, home to which are often taken to be, for the most part, grotesque giants, especially when translated into English. Stories of clashes between the gods and the giants abound, particularly in the case of Thor and Skrimir in the prose Edda, dating from roughly 1220, which bears similarities to the later Jack tales and the Germanic The Devil and the Three Golden Hairs. But hold on, we can go even deeper! I told you guys this one was a wormhole. While in the giant's home, Jack not only steals a bag of gold coins, but also a magic harp. Other magical items appear in Jack the Giant Killer, in which Jack is granted by a 3-headed giant a magic sword, a cap of knowledge, a cloak of invisibility, and shoes of swiftness. Many of these may have been borrowed from other tales in Celtic mythology, such as those in the Welsh Mabinogi. As a side note, the Mabinogi commonly features a literary device of drinking and then taking a nap, similar to how in Jack and the Beanstalk and The Devil and the Three Golden Hairs, the giant falls asleep. There are also connections with the Irish folk hero Finn McCool, who carried a special spear, and the magic shoes of the god Lugus, suggesting that the magical objects correlate with attributes shown by the earlier Celtic gods. In regards to Lugus, it's also interesting to note that he had 3 heads, just like the giant who gifts Jack his accessories in the fairy tale. Lugus is attested to be identified with the Roman inscriptions of the god Mercury, himself the counterpart of the Greek god Hermes, who wore winged sandals. Within Greek mythology, we also have the demigod Perseus, who was given a magic sword, Hermes' winged sandals, and Hades' cap of darkness in order to slay the Gorgon Medusa, drawing parallels with practically all the gifts that Jack bears in Jack the Giant Killer. Jack's manipulations, as similarly echoed in The Brave Little Tailor, can also be seen in the Greek story of Cadmus, king of Thebes. After Cadmus sows a dragon's teeth in the soil, a race of fierce armed warriors sprung from them, and Cadmus saved himself by tricking them into fighting each other. And last but not least, we have a connection with Hades. As well as borrowing his cap of darkness to Perseus, he owns the hound Cerberus, which has 3 heads like the giant in Jack the Giant Killer, and his realm is reached by ferry across the river Styx, exactly the same as Hell in The Devil and the Three Golden Hairs. Truly, the threads weaving the story of Jack and the Beanstalk together form such a complex web. This is just the basics of what I found in researching this episode. It's a story which can certainly be taken to mean many things, and it's for this reason why it persists in popular culture to this day. And breathe! That one was... Woo. I love when fairy tales open up such a can of worms, but at the same time I'm like, I'm going to be reading about this for a while. Thank you very much for joining me for this episode of Truth Behind the Tale. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please give it a big thumbs up if you did. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single episode. The next episode of Truth Behind the Tale will be coming on the last Tuesday of next month. Thank you for watching, have a good day, and I'll see you all again very soon in another video. Bye!